Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to talk about the South during the industrial era and going to talk about this idea of the New South, going to talk about race relations in the South during the second half of the 19th century. So we have this idea of the Old South, which is kind of a romanticized idea of what the southern United States was like before the Civil War. And it romanticizes the bravery of the Confederate troops, of life on the plantations. It minimizes the oppressive aspects of slavery. The idea of the New South that we see emerging during the second half of the 19th century is the idea of pursuing a northern-style industrial economy and move away from the agrarian style of the Old South. And basically to do what the North did that made it more wealthy and more successful, but only to do it better. And so there's a real veneration of those leaders of industry in the South who are seen as redeemers. They're seen as establishing themselves as genuine local leaders of this region, rather than allowing the region to be dominated by businessmen and women from the North. And so we see the emergence of southern industry. Cotton textile mills. Again, cotton is rebounding. Cotton's going to continue to be the major crop in the South, even though its price is falling. But now we find that cotton is not only being grown in the South, but is being produced in cotton textile mills as well. And the South becomes the leading producer of cotton in the region, overtaking the New England region. Also see the production of tobacco, and now not only just the growing of tobacco, but the producing of that tobacco into cigars and eventually into cigarettes. And this is an industry where the Duke Company that kind of pioneers this industry is based in North Carolina. They are just like the Rockefellers and the Carnegies, very wealthy, control basically all of the market in the production of tobacco. We also see the development of a coal industry in the Appalachian Mountains that have rich resources of coal. So Virginia, eastern Tennessee, and Kentucky, those sorts of areas. The discovery of iron ore in the southern Appalachians spurs or stimulates the creation and the development of Birmingham, Alabama as a leading industrial center in the South, a new emerging industrial center in the South. And so we see the rise of industry and this idea of the New South, but the South still remains extremely poor. It remains the poorest, at least in some parts. There are some people who are very wealthy, but those people who are poor are the poorest people in the United States. Cotton remains the most important crop. But its price is falling. The return that you get on investment is falling. And so most people in the South, most of the poorer farmers that make up most of the farming population in the South, don't even own their own land. By 1900, 70% of these farmers don't own their own land. And so instead, they fall prey to what's called the cotton lien system. And it's kind of like sharecropping, and it's kind of like the encomienda system of the Spanish explorers, in which the workers don't own the land, but they receive the equipment and the seeds necessary to cultivate the crop from the landowner, and they do this in exchange for receiving a quarter, or sometimes significantly less, of the profits from cultivating the cotton. And this is really not enough for these people ever to become independent or ever to come to own their own land. And so they're able to survive, but they're kind of trapped in a cycle of poverty. So we have growing success in the South, but we also have issues of poverty, and we also have increasingly difficult race relations. And this is partly the result of new generations coming of age after the Civil War who haven't known the Civil War. And among some of the white population, there's an opposition to African Americans exercising a role in society as equal citizens. And among some of the African American populations, there's a strong desire to carry out and implement and enjoy the rights that they see as having been won for them by the passage of the 13th and the 14th Amendments. We see racial resistance to African American participation in American democracy and American society during this period with the rise of what's called the Mississippi Plan. And these were a series of state constitutional amendments that were carried out or that were passed in the second half of the 19th century that imposed restrictions that were designed to disenfranchise African Americans, make it difficult or impossible for them to vote. And this included residency requirements that were very difficult for people who were poor to fulfill. So people who are part of this cotton lien system typically won't work the same land for more than a year at a time. And so they're kind of constantly moving to new land that they're going to farm as part of this lien system. And it means that they don't fulfill this residency requirement, means they're not going to vote. Those who committed certain crimes, not allowed to vote. Those who wanted to vote had to pay what was called a polling tax. There was a tax on being able to vote. Those who couldn't afford to pay that tax, or those who didn't want to take that money away from themselves and their families in order to do so, were not able to vote. Everyone who wanted to vote had to be able to pass a test, an oral exam, showing that they understood the workings of the Constitution. But the way in which this exam was administered and graded was very arbitrary. And that meant that those who wished to disenfranchise someone, especially if they were of a different race, it was quite easy for them to do so. And so over the period of the second half of the 19th century, we see a massive decline in African Americans voting in the South. 60%. The number of African Americans voting drops by about 60%. Among poor whites, it also drops by about 25%. Because this Mississippi Plan, these laws restricting the ability to vote, they're implemented and adopted by other southern states as well. And so this is a way in which you once again see the emergence of a white elite in the South. And this culture of marginalizing African Americans from the voting process also leads to problems with integration that are best expressed by the Supreme Court case of Plessy versus Ferguson. And this case was part of a trend of cases judged by local courts. Plessy versus Ferguson is a Supreme Court case. Precedents for this approach were found in the Supreme Court as well. And this is the approach of segregation, based on the idea of separate but equal. As long as the facilities that were offered to African Americans and to whites were equal, it was okay to restrict one race from using the facilities of another race. And so people were segregated on the grounds of race, justified by the fact that the way they were treated outside of segregation was that they were treated equally. Once the Supreme Court has said that this is permissible, the Supreme Court says that in 13th and the 14th Amendments make it lawful for the federal government to prohibit states from discriminating on the basis of race. But don't prohibit states, don't give the federal government the authority to prevent individuals and business organizations from discriminating on the basis of race. That's the role of the states. Kind of a complicated rationale to understand, but basically these court decisions are saying that the local states can determine whether or not they segregate people on the basis of race. And these southern states follow that principle. And this is what leads to Jim Crow laws, where something as straightforward as the water fountain is now segregated. You have a white water fountain and you have a colored water fountain. And this also gives rise to lynchings and violence when African Americans were considered to have breached their place, to have left this sphere that these segregation practices allowed them to live in. Then they were vulnerable to being treated with great violence and brutality. African Americans still found ways to resist. Typically, these were based around churches that became the center of African American culture in the South. It was also the case that segregation helped African Americans develop their own trades. That since there now had to be colored banks, colored barbershops, colored funeral homes, that African Americans were able to move into leadership roles in these positions. Now, this wasn't what segregation is necessarily intended at all, but it was an opportunity that African Americans in the South took advantage of. We also see the rise of the civil rights movement and leaders of the civil rights movement among African Americans. One of these is called Ida Wells, a woman who joined the African American middle class by becoming a teacher, becoming educated as a teacher, who after witnessing a lynching turned to producing a newspaper in which she condemned lynchings and tried to end the practice of lynching. This led to her being driven out of the South, and she moved to Chicago, and there she continued to advocate for the restoration of voting rights for African Americans and helped found the NAACP in order to continue this struggle for African American equality. Two other leaders that emerged during this period were Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Booker T. Washington is interesting because he founds one of the first historic black colleges, the Tuskegee Institute. It's a vocational training school, but it's basically the first African American, what today we would call a historic black college. And Booker T. Washington's approach to the difficult situation in the South is a little bit different. He argues that the way forward for African Americans is not through widespread social change and striking down the laws of segregation, but rather that individual African Americans need to improve themselves in order that then those who at the moment wish to exclude them from areas of society will accept them. Privately, he did lobby and he did work for changes to laws about segregation. But at least publicly, he didn't want to create a backlash, and so he followed this more pragmatic approach. He was criticized for this by Du Bois, who instead argued for a more militant approach and for unending unrest among African Americans until they were granted the rights that they were deserved. And so these are kind of the two wings of the civil rights movement, or the two approaches of the civil rights movement that we see beginning to form and develop in the late 19th century. Whether it's going to be a more pragmatic, gradual individual approach that's advocated by Washington, or whether it's going to be a faster, more violent approach that's advocated by Du Bois.